On June 14, 1973, in a small valley hidden between the mountains of eastern Kentucky, a wedding celebration turned into the deadliest night the region had ever witnessed. 11 people lost their lives before midnight. The man responsible was the father of the bride. This is the story of Harold Miller, a coal miner who worked underground for 31 years, a man who never raised his voice, who attended church every Sunday, and who loved his daughter Ruth more than anything in the world. This is the story of how a single moment of perceived betrayal shattered the mind of a man already broken by a lifetime of silent suffering. And this is the story of how the happiest day in a young woman's life became the darkest chapter in Appalachian history. To understand what happened that night, you need to understand the place. Harlan County, Kentucky, in the early 1970s, was a land of coal dust and church bells. The mountains surrounded the small towns, like prison walls, isolating communities from the rest of America. Men went down into the mines before sunrise and came back covered in black powder, coughing, aging decades in a matter of years. Women raised children, preserved food for winter, and prayed their husbands would come home alive. The Miller family had lived in Leatherwood Hollow for 4 generations. Harold Miller was born in 1924, the third of 7 children, most of whom died before reaching adulthood. Poverty was not a condition in Harlan County. It was the air people breathed. Harold started working in the mines at 14, lying about his age to help feed his younger siblings after his father was crushed in a tunnel collapse. By the time Harold was 49, in 1973, he had survived 3 mine accidents, lost 2 brothers to lung disease, and buried a wife who died giving birth to their only child, Ruth. That child became everything to him. Ruth was born on a freezing February, a night in 1953, and from the moment Harold held her in his arms, he made a silent vow. She would have a better life than he ever did. Ruth grew up surrounded by her father's devotion. He worked double shifts to buy her books, dresses, and shoes that did not have holes in them. He walked her to school every morning until she was old enough to go alone. He taught her to read before she started 1st grade, sitting by candlelight after long days underground, his blackened hands turning the pages of fairy tales and poetry. In a place where girls were often married off by 16 and expected to have children by 18, Harold wanted something different for Ruth. He encouraged her to dream. He told her she could become a teacher, a nurse, anything she wanted. He saved every dollar he could spare in a rusted tin box under his bed, dreaming of the day Ruth would leave Harlan County and find the life she deserved. But Ruth fell in love. His name was Thomas Whitfield, and he came from a family that Harold Miller despised. The Whitfields were not miners. They owned a general store in the town of Evarts, about 12 miles from Leatherwood Hollow. While the Millers and families like them suffocated underground, the Whitfields sold overpriced goods and extended credit at crushing interest rates. Harold had watched his own father die, owing money to the Whitfield store. He had seen neighbors lose their homes, their dignity, their hope, all while the Whitfields built a bigger house on the hill. Thomas Whitfield was 24 years old in 1973. He was handsome, educated, and charming. He had attended 2 years of college in Lexington before returning to help run the family business. He dressed in clean clothes, spoke in smooth sentences, and drove a Ford pickup truck that actually worked. To Ruth Miller, who had never been more than 30 miles from Leatherwood Hollow, Thomas Whitfield seemed like a prince from another world. They met at a church social in the spring of 1972. Ruth was 19, working as a waitress at a diner in Evarts, saving money for a secretarial course she hoped to take in the fall. Thomas came in for coffee one afternoon and stayed for 2 hours, talking to her between customers, making her laugh in a way no one ever had. The courtship was secret at first. Ruth knew her father would disapprove, so she met Thomas in hidden places. behind the church, at the edge of the woods, in the back room, of the diner after closing. But secrets do not last long in small towns. By the summer of 1972, everyone in Leatherwood Hollow knew that Ruth Miller was seeing a Whitfield boy. Harold's reaction was exactly what Ruth had feared. He did not shout. Harold Miller never shouted. Instead, he sat in his chair by the window, staring at the mountains, and spoke in a voice so quiet Ruth had to lean in to hear him. He told her that the Whitfields were not good people. He told her that Thomas would use her and discard her. He told her that marrying into that family would be a betrayal of everything the Millers had suffered. He told her that he had spent his entire life trying to give her a chance to escape this place, and she was choosing to chain herself to the very people who had kept them in poverty for generations. Ruth listened. She cried. She told her father she loved him, and then she told him she loved Thomas too. The engagement was announced in January of 1973. The wedding was set for June 14th. Harold Miller attended the announcement dinner at the Whitfield home, sitting in silence while everyone else celebrated. He shook Thomas's hand when it was offered. He even managed a smile when Ruth looked at him with pleading eyes. But something changed in Harold that night. His co-workers at the mine noticed it first. He became quieter than usual, which was saying something for a man who barely spoke. He started making mistakes. Underground, dangerous mistakes that could have killed him and others. His foreman, a man named Earl Combs, pulled him aside one afternoon and asked if everything was all right at home. Harold just stared at him with empty eyes and said, everything was fine. The months leading up to the wedding were tense in the Miller household. Ruth tried to include her father in the planning, asking his opinion on flowers, music, food. Harold nodded at everything but contributed nothing. He signed the checks Ruth needed for her dress, her shoes, the deposit on the church hall. He never complained about the money, but he never smiled either. What no one knew, not even Ruth, was that Harold Miller was unraveling inside. 31 years of breathing coal dust had damaged more than his lungs. The constant darkness, the fear, the loss, the grinding poverty, it had all accumulated like sediment in his mind. And now, watching his only daughter prepare to marry the son of his enemies, something in Harold finally cracked. He began having nightmares. He saw his father's crushed body. He saw his wife's pale face as she bled out after childbirth. He saw Ruth as a little girl, reaching for him, calling for him, and then being pulled away by hands he could not see. He woke up most nights drenched in sweat, heart pounding, unable to distinguish between memory and hallucination. He also started drinking. Harold had never been much of a drinker, maybe a beer or two on Saturday nights, but now he was finishing a bottle of whiskey every few days. He hid the bottles in the barn, under hay bales, behind rusted equipment. He drank alone, in the dark, talking to ghosts only he could see, and he started carrying his father's revolver. The weapon had been in the Miller family for decades, a heavy .38 caliber Smith & Wesson that Harold's father had bought during the mine wars of the 1930s. Harold cleaned it one night in April, oiling the chambers, loading the cylinder with 6 rounds. He told himself it was for protection. He told himself the mountains were not as safe as they used to be. He told himself a lot of things that spring, but deep down, in a place he refused to examine, Harold Miller was preparing for something. He did not know what. He did not plan anything specific, but the revolver became a constant presence, tucked into his belt, hidden under his jacket, a cold weight against his hip that somehow made him feel more in control. June 14th arrived. Under a cloudless sky, the wedding ceremony was held at the Mount Zion Baptist Church, a small, white building that had served the community for over 100 years. Ruth looked beautiful in a dress she had sewn herself, white lace with tiny pearl buttons, her dark hair pinned up with wildflowers from the meadow behind her house. Thomas stood at the altar in a new suit, smiling like a man who had won the greatest prize in the world. Harold sat in the front pew, wearing his only good suit, a dark, brown thing he had bought for his wife's funeral 20 years earlier. His hands were folded in his lap. His face showed nothing. When the preacher asked who gave this woman to be married, Harold stood, said the words, and sat back down. Ruth squeezed his hand as she passed. He did not squeeze back. The reception was held in the church hall, a large wooden building adjacent to the church. About 80 people attended, nearly everyone from Leatherwood Hollow, plus a contingent of Whitfields and their associates from Evarts. Long tables were covered with food, fried chicken, biscuits, green beans, corn on the cob, apple pie. A local band played country music in the corner. Children ran between the tables while adults laughed, danced, and celebrated. Harold Miller stood alone near the back door, a glass of punch in his hand that he never drank. He watched his daughter dancing with her new husband, watched the Whitfield family congratulating themselves, watched the whole scene as if it were happening on a movie screen, distant and unreal. Check if you are already subscribed to this channel. If stories like this one make you feel something, if you want to understand the darkness that lives inside ordinary people, then this is where you belong. Subscribe now, because what happens next will stay with you forever. At approximately 8:30 in the evening, something happened that would ignite the tragedy. Harold had stepped outside for air, standing in the gravel parking lot, staring at the mountains turning purple in the fading light. The church hall was loud behind him, music and laughter spilling through the open windows. He was thinking about his wife, about the day Ruth was born, about all the dreams he had carried for so long. That was when he heard the voices. 2 men were standing around the corner of the building, smoking cigarettes, unaware that Harold was nearby. One of them was Vernon Whitfield, Thomas's older brother. The other was a man Harold did not recognize, some friend or relative from Evarts. Vernon was laughing about something, and then Harold heard his own name. Vernon said that Harold Miller was pathetic, that he had spent his whole life underground like a mole and did not even have the sense to know when he was being used, that the whole Miller family was nothing but white trash, and it was hilarious that Thomas was actually going through with this wedding just to get access to the coal rights on Miller land. Harold froze. Coal rights. The words hit him like a physical blow. The Miller family had owned a small parcel of land in Leatherwood Hollow for generations, land that sat above a coal seam that had never been mined. Harold had refused to sell the rights to the mining companies because he did not want his family's land torn apart. But the rights were valuable, potentially worth more money than Harold would earn in 10 lifetimes. Vernon kept talking, laughing. He said that Thomas had played Ruth perfectly, that once they were married, the coal rights would become community property, and the Whitfields would finally get what they had wanted for decades. He called Ruth a foolish girl. He called Harold a stupid old man who did not even know he was being robbed. The other man laughed and asked if Ruth knew. Vernon said of course she did not know. Thomas was smarter than that. By the time she figured it out, it would be too late. Harold stood in the darkness, his heart pounding, his vision narrowing. Every fear he had ever had about the Whitfields, every warning he had given Ruth, it was all true. His daughter had not married for love. She had been deceived, manipulated, used as a pawn to steal the only valuable thing the Miller family had ever possessed. Something broke inside Harold Miller at that moment, not like a bone snapping, but like a dam collapsing, releasing 31 years of rage, grief, humiliation, and despair. His hand moved to his hip, to the revolver hidden under his jacket. He did not remember making a conscious decision. He did not remember pulling the weapon from his belt. He did not remember walking around the corner of the building. All he remembered later was Vernon Whitfield's face turning toward him, the cigarette falling from his lips, the first flash of fear in his eyes, and then the sound of the first shot. Vernon went down immediately, clutching his chest, his mouth opening and closing without sound. The other man tried to run, but Harold's second shot caught him in the back. He fell face first into the gravel, twitched once, and was still. The music inside the church hall stopped. For a moment there was only silence, and then someone screamed. Harold walked toward the building. Inside the church hall, chaos erupted. People who had heard the shots were already running for the exits. Others stood frozen, confused, not understanding what was happening. Thomas Whitfield was pushing through the crowd toward the front door, trying to see what had happened to his brother. He never made it. Harold came through the back door, the revolver in his hand, his face completely blank. He saw Thomas standing in the middle of the room, saw the Whitfield family gathering near the front, saw his daughter Ruth screaming his name. He raised the weapon and started firing. The next 60 seconds would be reconstructed dozens of times in the years that followed, by investigators, by journalists, by the lone survivor who testified at the trial. What emerged was a picture of methodical horror. Harold Miller did not fire randomly. He targeted Whitfield family members specifically. Thomas was hit twice. His father, Edgar Whitfield, was hit once as he tried to shield his wife. Two of Thomas's cousins, both young men in their 20s, were struck as they rushed toward Harold, trying to stop him. The revolver held 6 rounds. Harold emptied it, reloaded from bullets in his pocket, and kept firing. He had brought 18 rounds with him that night. 18 bullets, because some part of his fractured mind had planned for exactly this moment. People were screaming, running, trampling each other to escape. Some dove under tables, others crashed through windows. The band members fled through a back storage room. Children were crying, separated from their parents in the pandemonium, and Harold kept walking forward, kept firing, kept taking Whitfield lives with the precision of a man who had spent decades working in darkness, knowing exactly where to step, exactly what to do. Ruth Miller threw herself at her father, grabbing his arm, begging him to stop. Harold paused, looked at her face, and for a moment something like recognition flickered in his eyes. Then he pushed her away, gently, almost tenderly, and turned back toward the remaining Whitfields. By the time the revolver clicked empty for the 3rd time, 11 people were on the ground. 9 of them were Whitfields. 2 were bystanders who had been too close, caught in the crossfire. Thomas was still alive, barely, clutching his stomach, his new wedding suit soaked in red. His father, Edgar, was already gone. Harold stood in the center of the church hall, surrounded by overturned tables and broken glass and bodies, and the echoes of his daughter's screaming. He looked at the weapon in his hand, as if seeing it for the first time. Then he looked at Ruth, who was cradling Thomas's head in her lap, her white wedding dress stained crimson. He said one sentence, "I did this, for you." Then he walked out the front door and disappeared into the mountains. The response to the tragedy was immediate but chaotic. This was rural Kentucky in 1973, with no cell phones, no internet, just one telephone line in the church office that someone managed to use to call for help. The nearest hospital was in Harlan, over 20 miles away on winding mountain roads. The nearest significant police presence was the county sheriff's department, which had exactly 4 deputies on duty that night. The first ambulance arrived 43 minutes after the shooting stopped. By then, 3 more people had died from their wounds, including Thomas Whitfield, who passed away in Ruth's arms without ever regaining consciousness. The survivors were loaded into whatever vehicles were available, personal cars and pickup trucks racing toward Harlan in the darkness, honking at each other on the narrow roads, headlights cutting through the mountain fog. Ruth refused to leave. She sat in the church hall among the bodies, her father's words echoing in her mind. "I did this for you." She did not cry. She did not speak. She just sat there, staring at nothing, while emergency workers and volunteers stepped around her, carrying out the dead. Sheriff Walter Benton arrived on scene at approximately 10:15. He was a large man in his 50s, a former Marine who had seen combat in Korea, and even he was unprepared for what he found in that church hall. He would later tell reporters that it looked like a battlefield. Chairs and tables thrown everywhere, bullet holes in the walls, the floor slick with what he refused to describe. The initial investigation was hampered by confusion and grief. Witnesses were in shock, giving contradictory accounts of what had happened. Some said Harold had targeted everyone indiscriminately. Others said he only shot Whitfields. Some said Ruth had tried to stop him. Others said she had just stood there and watched. The one thing everyone agreed on was that Harold Miller had walked into the mountains after the shooting, and no one had seen him since. The manhunt began at dawn on June 15th. Sheriff Benton called in support from neighboring counties, the Kentucky State Police, and eventually the FBI, which had jurisdiction over crimes involving multiple deaths. By noon, over 200 law enforcement officers and volunteers were combing the mountains around Leatherwood Hollow, looking for a 50-year-old coal miner who knew those hills better than anyone alive. The Appalachian Mountains are not like other terrain. They are ancient, worn down by millions of years of erosion, covered in dense forest and riddled with caves, abandoned mine shafts, and hollows so remote that no human had set foot in them for generations. A man who wanted to disappear in those mountains could do so indefinitely, especially a man like Harold Miller, who had grown up exploring every ridge and valley. For 3 days, the search. Teams found nothing. They discovered old camps, abandoned moonshiners' stills, even the skeleton of a Civil War soldier in a forgotten cave, but no sign of Harold. The media descended on Harlan County, reporters from Louisville, Lexington, even New York, all wanting to tell the story of the wedding massacre. They interviewed anyone who would talk, painting a picture of a backward mountain community torn apart by violence. Ruth Miller refused all interviews. She stayed in her father's house, the Geestum, same house where she had grown up, sitting in his chair by the window, staring at the mountains where he had disappeared. Neighbors brought food. The preacher came to pray with her. She acknowledged none of it. On the 4th day, a tracking dog picked up Harold's scent near an abandoned mine entrance about 6 miles from Leatherwood Hollow. The entrance had been boarded up for decades, condemned after a collapse in 1947, but the boards had been recently pulled away. Sheriff Benton led a team of 6 men into the mine. What they found inside would haunt all of them for the rest of their lives. Harold Miller was sitting about 300 yards into the tunnel, his back against the wall, the empty revolver in his lap. He was alive but barely responsive, severely dehydrated, his eyes focused on something none of them could see. He had scratched words into the rock wall beside him, using a piece of coal. They took everything. He did not resist arrest. He did not speak. He simply allowed himself to be lifted, carried out of the darkness, and loaded into a waiting vehicle. As they drove past the church where the massacre had occurred, where workers were still cleaning up the aftermath, Harold turned his head and stared at the building until it disappeared from view. The trial of Harold Miller began in September of 1973 in the Harlan County Courthouse. It was the most heavily attended trial in the county's history, with spectators lining up before dawn to get seats. The national media covered every moment, portraying it as a clash between ancient mountain feuds and modern American justice. The prosecution's case was straightforward. Harold Miller had deliberately armed himself, attended his daughter's wedding, and murdered 11 people in cold blood. The motive, whatever it was, did not matter. Kentucky law was clear. Premeditated murder of multiple victims warranted the most severe penalty available. The defense took a different approach. Harold's attorney, a young public defender named Samuel Reese, argued that Harold had suffered a complete psychological break, triggered by decades of trauma and the revelation of the Whitfields' conspiracy to steal his family's land. He presented witnesses who testified about Harold's mental deterioration in the months before the wedding, his nightmares, his drinking, his increasingly erratic behavior. He also presented evidence about the Colwrights. This was the most explosive revelation of the trial. Samuel Reese had obtained documents showing that Edgar Whitfield had been quietly negotiating with a coal company for months before the wedding, promising them access to the Miller land seam once Thomas married Ruth. The terms of the deal would have made the Whitfields wealthy and left Ruth with nothing. Vernon Whitfield's words, overheard by Harold that night, were exactly what they seemed: a confession of a conspiracy to defraud Ruth Miller of her inheritance. The courtroom erupted. Reporters scrambled to file stories. The surviving Whitfield family members denied everything, but the documents were damning. If you are watching this story unfold and feeling the weight of what happened that night, pause for a moment. Think about the last time you heard something that changed everything you believed. Now leave a comment saying, "I understand Harold's pain." Let me know that you are following this story, that you feel what these mountains felt on that terrible night. The jury deliberated for 6 days. The verdict, when it came, was complicated. Harold Miller was found guilty of 11 counts of second-degree murder, not first-degree. The jury concluded that while the killings were intentional, they were not premeditated in the legal sense. Harold had not planned to commit murder when he left his house that morning. He had armed himself out of paranoia and mental illness, and the decision to fire had been made in a moment of psychological collapse, not rational planning. The sentence was life imprisonment without parole, to be served at the Kentucky State Penitentiary in Eddyville. Harold Miller showed no reaction when the sentence was read. He had not spoken a single word since his arrest. Ruth Miller attended every day of the trial. She sat in the back row, wearing black, watching everything with an expression that no one could read. When the verdict was announced, she stood up, looked at her father one last time, and walked out of the courthouse. She never spoke to him again. The aftermath of the Crimson Wedding, as the media called it, reshaped Harlan County in ways that persisted for decades. The Colwrights dispute was eventually settled in Ruth's favor after years of litigation. The documents Samuel Reese had uncovered proved that the Whitfield family had engaged in fraud, and the proposed deal with the coal company was voided. Ruth sold the rights herself for a sum that would have seemed astronomical to her father, and used the money to leave Kentucky forever. She moved to Cincinnati, changed her name, and built a new life. She never married again. She never had children. According to people who knew her in later years, she rarely spoke about her past, and when asked about her family, she simply said they were gone. The Whitfield family never recovered from the scandal. The revelations about their conspiracy destroyed their reputation, and their business slowly failed. By 1980, the general store in Evarts had closed, and most of the family had scattered to other states, trying to escape the shadow of that night. The Mount Zion Baptist Church was torn down in 1975 after the congregation voted that no one could worship in a building stained by so much tragedy. A new church was built on a different site, smaller and simpler, without a reception hall attached. And Harold Miller spent the next 23 years in prison, silent and unresponsive, a ghost in a concrete cell. He never requested visitors. He never wrote letters. He never participated in any programs or activities. He simply existed, day after day, staring at walls that were not so different from the mine tunnels where he had spent his working life. He died in 1996 of complications from black lung disease, the same condition that had killed his brothers decades before. He was 72 years old. His last words, spoken to a prison chaplain the night before he passed, were, "Tell Ruth I'm sorry I was not stronger." Ruth did not attend the funeral. By then, she was living in Arizona, working as a librarian, a quiet woman in her 40s who smiled politely at patrons and went home every night to an empty apartment. She received notification of her father's death through a lawyer's letter, read it once, and burned it. But according to those who knew her, something changed after that letter arrived. She started visiting churches again, something she had not done since 1973. She started talking just a little about her childhood in Kentucky, about the mountains, about a man who loved her so much he destroyed everything. And 1 year after Harold's death, Ruth Miller returned to Harlan County for the first time in over 2 decades. She came alone, driving a rental car through the winding mountain roads, stopping at places she remembered from childhood. The diner where she had worked was gone, replaced by a gas station. The house where she had grown up was still standing, abandoned now, the windows broken, the roof sagging. She stood in the overgrown yard for a long time, looking at the chair by the window where her father used to sit. Then she drove to the cemetery where Harold had been buried, in a small plot purchased by the state because no one else would pay for it. The grave had no marker, just a metal stake with a number. Ruth stood there for hours, until the sun set and the mountains turned dark around her. No one knows what she said to her father that night, or if she said anything at all. But when she left Harlan County the next morning, witnesses say she looked different somehow, lighter, as if she had finally set down a weight she'd been carrying for 24 years. Ruth Miller died in 2015 in a hospice in Tucson, Arizona. She was 62 years old, taken by a cancer she had ignored for too long. Her final request was that her ashes be scattered in the Appalachian Mountains, in a hollow she described in careful detail, a place where wildflowers bloomed every spring and you could see 3 states from the ridge. A lawyer carried out her wishes, traveling to Kentucky with a small urn, following the directions Ruth had written out by hand. He found the hollow, exactly as she had described it, beautiful and peaceful, the kind of place where you could almost forget that terrible things had ever happened. He scattered her ashes at sunset, and as he did, he read aloud a letter Ruth had written to be opened only after her death. It said, "I spent my whole life trying to understand what my father did. I hated him for it. I pitied him for it. I grieved for him and for everyone who died. But in the end, I realized that the tragedy was not just one night in a church hall. The tragedy was a whole life of poverty, of loss, of a man who had nothing except love for his daughter and who watched that love being used against him. My father was not a monster. He was a broken man who broke further, and I was the reason he finally shattered. I do not ask anyone to forgive him. I am not sure I forgive him myself, but I understand him now in a way I never could when I was young and full of anger. He did a terrible thing because he believed terrible things were being done to me. He was wrong about how to respond, but he was not wrong about the world. The world is hard and cruel, and it takes everything from people like us. My father fought back the only way he knew how. I wish he had found another way. I wish I had listened to him. I wish so many things, but wishes do not change history. They only change how we carry it." The lawyer finished reading, folded the letter, and left it on a rock beside the scattered ashes. He drove back to the city that night and never returned to those mountains. The story of the Crimson Wedding is still told in Harlan County, passed down through generations as a warning about pride, greed, and the terrible cost of betrayal. Old-timers remember Harold Miller as a quiet man who worked hard and loved his daughter. They remember Ruth as a bright girl who deserved better than what life gave her. They remember the Whitfields as people who pushed too hard, took too much, and paid the ultimate price. But mostly they remember that night in June of 1973, when the mountains ran red and a father's love turned into something no one could survive. If you watched until here, it is because this story touched something inside you. Leave a comment saying, "I watched until here," so I can know who truly feels these stories, who stays until the end, who understands that behind every tragedy there is a human being who once had hope. Like this video, if it made you feel something real. Share it with someone who needs to hear this story, someone who understands that the world is complicated and that people are capable of both great love and terrible destruction. And subscribe to this channel because we tell stories that matter, stories that stay with you long after the screen goes dark. The mountains of Appalachia are quiet now. The old mines have closed. The families have scattered. But if you drive through Leatherwood Hollow on a summer evening, just as the sun is setting and the shadows grow long, old residents say you can still feel something in the air, a heaviness, a sorrow that never quite faded. And if you stop at the spot where the Mount Zion Baptist Church once stood, where 11 people took their last breaths on what should have been the happiest night of a young woman's life, you might understand what Harold Miller felt in those final moments before everything changed. Love is the most powerful force in the world. It can build empires and heal wounds and make people believe that anything is possible. But love, twisted by fear and pain and the weight of a lifetime of suffering, can also destroy. It can take a good man and turn him into something unrecognizable. It can take a beautiful day and turn it into a nightmare that echoes through decades. Harold Miller loved his daughter. That was never in question. He loved her so much that when he believed she was being used, being stolen, being made into a fool by people who had tormented his family for generations, something inside him snapped. He did not see individuals in that church hall. He saw enemies. He saw the faces of everyone who had ever looked down on him, cheated him, called him names, kept him poor, and desperate and afraid. He saw every injustice he had ever suffered, concentrated into a single moment of violent clarity. He was wrong. Violence is never the answer. The people who died that night, even the Whitfields who had conspired against Ruth, did not deserve what happened to them. There were children in that room. There were innocent bystanders. There were people whose only crime was accepting a wedding invitation. Harold Miller destroyed lives that night, including his own, including Ruth's. He spent his remaining years in a cage, and Ruth spent hers running from a past she could never escape. The Whitfield conspiracy, even if it had succeeded, would not have justified a single drop of what was shed on that church hall floor. But this story is not told to justify. It is told to understand. It is told because human beings are complicated, because tragedy rarely has simple causes, because the same heart that holds love can also hold rage, and because sometimes those two forces collide with devastating results. If there is a lesson in the crimson wedding of the Appalachians, it is this: pay attention to the quiet ones. Pay attention to the people who suffer in silence, who swallow their pain day after day, who smile even when they are breaking inside. Pay attention, because suffering does not disappear just because it is not expressed. It accumulates, it builds pressure, and eventually, if nothing relieves it, it explodes. Harold Miller was a warning sign that no one read. His daughter tried to reach him, but she was young and in love, and did not understand the depth of his despair. His co-workers noticed changes, but did not know how to help. His community saw a man withdrawing, but assumed he was just dealing with his daughter's wedding in his own way. By the time anyone realized how far gone he was, 11 people were already dying in a church hall. The mountains remember. The mountains always remember. They were here long before the Millers and the Whitfields, long before the coal mines and the churches, long before anyone carved out a life in these valleys. They will be here long after all the participants in this story have been forgotten. But the story itself will endure, passed from generation to generation, a reminder that we are all capable of darkness, that love and hate are closer than we want to believe, and that the most ordinary day can become a catastrophe in the span of a heartbeat. This was the crimson wedding of the Appalachians. This was Harold Miller, Ruth Miller, Thomas Whitfield, and 11 souls who never saw the sun rise on June 15th, 1973. May they rest in peace, and may we learn from what they suffered.